Well, in today's video, I want to talk about an issue that I think does not get enough attention in our debates about social class and socioeconomic class, and that is the subject of why upper class professionals tend to resent business people. Now, I think with the rise of Donald Trump and populist movements and so forth, there's been more attention. Now, a lot of the rhetoric and discourse about inequality and so forth, about different tensions in our society. And I think that much of the conversation has been defined around two forms of tension in society. One is between what's often called the working class, or in more racialized terms, the white working class. And then the other, obviously, is on ethnic sort of lines. Now, on this socioeconomic point, one of the more influential books that's been written since Donald Trump's election is by a professor named Joan Williams, and her finding, she's a distinguished academic, but she comes from a more working class kind of background. And one of the things that she argues in her book is that much of the support that drove Trump to power was a resentment of this upper class, professional class. And so what her basic argument was that people in this working class, it's not that they resent wealth or wealthy people. In fact, they actually like it and want it and admire people who are wealthy. But what they resent is specifically this one subset of the upper class, which are professionals. And by professionals, she means people like doctors, lawyers, engineers. And so she talks in the book, for example, about how when she was growing up, the people around her, they could barely talk about doctors without also adding in the word quack. And so this sort of contempt just really emerged in this election, where Hillary Clinton embodied in every way this sort of pantsuited professional technocrat who they despise, versus Donald Trump, who is this successful businessman, but without the pretenses and so forth of this professional class. But I think one of the problems of attributing much of this Trump backlash to the working class is, in fact, that when you actually look at the studies and base of support that really drove Trump to power, it actually didn't really come from this working class necessarily. I mean, they certainly swang enough as a block to tip the scales for Trump, but really the core driver in many ways of Trump's support are actually coming from demographics who, more than anything else, fear that they're about to be on the losing end of a lot of different curves. And this is why one of the reasons why so much of Trump's support actually doesn't come from this lower segment. It actually comes from seemingly successful upper class professionals who are doing fine, but are perceiving ahead that they may be on the losing end of different trends. And I'll talk about whether or not that's correct later. And so now the question is why, what's driving this resentment from the upper class, and I think a big part of it is something that I think has not generated enough commentary, which is the resentment that upper class professionals often have toward business people and entrepreneurs. Now, I began to think about this issue really after the election, when I was a magazine editor, and it was the first time that I really, after a fairly successful stint of kind of being part of this upper class professional class that had gone to the right schools and so forth, I, for the first time, felt the sting of not really having enough money. And it wasn't that I was poor, that my day-to-day life wasn't fine. I mean, obviously it was, but I felt the sting in two ways. One was that when I had a fallout with the Trump campaign and then eventually the administration, I realized that a lot of my just ability to maneuver and be relevant and build in politics and so forth was ultimately contingent on basically appeasing or going by a certain set of rules by other people who were not necessarily more intelligent or more capable than me, but what they did have was more money, and with money, the clout that comes with that. And the other thing that I realized was that having done a lot of different research on health and so forth, one of the things I realized was that this sort of technocratic class of doctors and healthcare professionals actually don't really know what they're talking about, and are, in addition to their ignorance, are just corrupted by all kinds of poor professional incentives and so forth. And that really the only way to ultimately be healthy and to get what you want is having enough discretionary income and having the ability to work around the system. So as I began to think through, I decided, okay, I need to get this money thing handled and do it on my terms. And so I began to read a lot of different books, and I began to study the people who are wealthy or people who are financially successful and how you become wealthy. And I realized, not surprisingly, that when you want to learn a new skill or you want to learn a new goal, the way to catalyze the change, really the foundation has to be interrogating your mindset, interrogating what you believe, and then seeing what you actually have to change. And one of the things that I realized over time was that, I realized a couple things. One was that, first of all, a lot of the people who I grew up with, who were my peers in school, were the people I admired, were actually not necessarily, they were successful, but they weren't successful necessarily financially. And that the people who had achieved the financial goals that I now had were coming from different sectors and segments of society. And then the other thing that I realized was, well, then I had to ask, why is this? Why am I not part of this class of people who are wealthy? And one of the things I realized was that a big part of my mindset and my sociology around money and wealth and success had come from growing up, not only growing up in, but also really absorbing the values of people in the upper class, what I'm calling here the upper class professionals. So like my father is a distinguished radiation oncologist, and my mom worked. She used to be an engineer, then she stayed home. She now works in university, and then like her family were had distinguished lawyers and academics and so forth. But although we were certainly not we were comfortable financially, but not wealthy in any serious kind of a way. And I began to realize that the people who really do attain a great deal of wealth and financial success often, or usually, obviously, come from not necessarily being professionals, but more by starting businesses, being entrepreneurs, owning, appreciating assets, which is just a different game altogether. Now, and one of the things I realized was that a big part of why people in the upper class and upper class professionals, why they have a hard time making that transition to being genuinely wealthy, is because they're not willing to do the things that business people, that entrepreneurs aren't willing to do. And so I began to question why. Why is that? Now, I think a big part of it has to do with understanding what is the path to becoming a respected upper class professional. Like, what do you have to do? What are the mindsets and so forth? And I think if I were to say, like, what is the defining thing that really catapults someone into the realm of an upper class professional, what it really comes down to more than anything is that upper class professionals generally tend to be the big winners of zero-sum institutions. So, in other words, these are the people who they really buy into major mainstream institutions, notably the educational establishment, and they're basically the ones who compete like hell for a finite number of spots in a certain hierarchy or ranking or whatever. So, so for example, like, these are the people who end up in the top 1% or 5% of their academic class, which then gets them into the right college, which then, maybe gets them into the right graduate program, which then gets them like the coveted spot in a private practice or like in a practice in a medical field, or maybe in a financial field, Maybe they become like a consultant somewhere, but they, and then basically what the path from there is that they work for other people. They work for other institutions, they play by the rules, and then they get a paycheck, and it's a paycheck that grows over time. So how do you succeed at being an upper class professional? And I think there are a couple of things. One is that you have to have a certain genetic baseline, and this genetic baseline usually involves an IQ that's high, but not too high, because if you're too high of an IQ, then you have a harder time relating to people and checking your contrarian impulses. But you also need a high enough IQ to be able to do the basic analytic work. The second thing is that there's a very high premium on being a perfectionist, of not failing, of really like doing things right, and the reason is obviously that one bad grade, literally, one failed project, one shortcoming can be the difference between being wildly successful and not being successful. Like if you look at the law school admissions realm, which is what I know, at the end of the day, like the difference between having a 3.95 GPA and a 3.85 GPA is not a whole lot, but it basically is a difference between getting into a top 5 law school and basically maybe even getting into not even a top 20 law school. So and these are like the pressures and the challenges that upper class professionals have to have. And then the final thing, and this is an area that I think people don't talk about enough, is that upper class professionals are both they become that, but they also are rewarded for having an attitude of snobbery. And I'm saying snobbery, it's usually a term with negative connotations, but I'm talking about it in a more neutral light. That one of the things that's a belief that upper class professionals have that I think is a contributor to their success is the fact that they very deliberately and consciously differentiate themselves from people in other classes, and not only differentiate, but they think of themselves as being superior on the grounds of their achievements, their values, their worldliness, their sophistication. And so like one of the things, for example, when I was growing up, my brother and I, we learned at a very young age this word blue collar. And the way the word blue collar was used was, it was not like actually a commentary on a certain type of work, but it was really a value judgment that actually had really at the end of the day nothing to do with how one made their money. So blue collar would be, for example, like if we were, let's say, at a mall or something, and you saw like some guy who was dressed in a like a t-shirt and jeans and was kind of like shouting and behaving in an uncouth kind of way. It didn't really matter what the guy's profession was or how much money he had, but he was exhibiting blue collar behavior. And we just sort of like learned at a young age that you don't want to be blue collar, not only in terms of your profession, but also in terms of how you behave yourself. And I remember, like, I always found this very amusing, but it wasn't something that I talked about. Like, I didn't want to, I figured this was one of those things that you talk about in the privacy of your home, but you don't really talk about. But I remember, like, recently I was having a conversation with a friend of mine. She's a lawyer also, and her father is a distinguished lawyer and a diplomat and so forth. And we were talking about this, and I mentioned this blue collar thing, and she was like, "Oh yeah, my family did that too." And she was saying like blue collar meant that's what they were called when they wore trashy clothes or whatever. So they have this belief, and they take a real pride in the sophistication that they have and this way that's differentiated them. And one of the reasons actually why I decided to launch a law school admissions practice was that there are a lot of consultants out there who will give you like the technocratic details of how you get into law school, but the thing that's really missing and the thing that really differentiates people who actually get into these top schools from ones who don't are people who whether accidentally or deliberately adopt a certain mindset, adopt a certain like cultural or socioeconomic ethos, and these are issues that we just don't like feel comfortable talking about, but they're a reality. Okay, so where does the resentment come in? And the resentment comes in because when upper class professionals reach a certain point at their career, it could be maybe when they're in graduate school, it could be when they're actually practicing or whatever. They often hit a point or reach a conclusion of the sort that I reached after the elections, which is that, for all this like pride that upper class professionals have in their achievements and so forth, they realize that there is one class of people who are a real threat to them. And that group of people is business people. And the reason is because business people have something that they don't have, but they aspire to. And that is, one, wealth beyond a certain level. So like, even if you're a partner at a top law firm, or even if you're a really thriving, even if you're a really successful doctor or whatever, I mean, you're just not making, you realize that after all that investment, all that time, there's some schmuck out there who went to the University of Idaho State, who runs like a used car dealership or something, who makes more than a year than you've made in the last 5 years. And this is a very jarring thing. And it's a jarring thing for two reasons. One, that money can obviously get you the material things that upper class people want, even if they sort of deny it, whether it's a nice vacation or a nice car or a nice home or whatever. But the other thing, and the thing that's really grating, is that with the money comes all the other, the ability to do all these other things that upper class people aspire to do, which is, for example, engage in philanthropy, or like donate to a political campaign, or make an investment in the stock market. Like all these things that they want to do are now suddenly not available. And so like, for example, they face this dilemma that I felt, for example, whereas like you have all these great ideas, you have all th's ideas on how to improve the world, but who do people in power listen to? It's the guy who can write a check. But the problem is that it's hard for someone in the upper class to now make this transition to becoming a business person, and especially an entrepreneur, for two reasons. The first is that there's just so much, by the time you come to this conclusion, you're now, there's a lot of sunk cost in here. You've spent so much of your time and energy kind of developing certain traits, like ingratiating yourself in certain networks, that there's a great deal of what my friend David Lesperance calls life inertia that you have to overcome. But the other factor here is that even if you do make a decision to try to change and become more entrepreneurial or go into business, all of a sudden all the attributes that led to your success as an upper class professional are now becoming liabilities. So if you look at what really makes someone good at business or good at entrepreneurship, it's many of the traits that were actually punished in this upper class professional rat race. So for example, one is a high tolerance for failure. Like over and over again, when you look at people who are entrepreneurs, they'll fail 10 times or 50 times or 100 times, and then they'll hit the right idea. But that one idea will like really take off and make it all worth it. This is an ethos that is very hard for an upper class professional. I think another major one is empathy. So in order to obviously create a service or a product or a business or whatever that people actually want to buy, you have to have a very high degree of empathy. You have to be able to understand, like, even more so than your customers, like what are their emotional pain points? What are they really in pain about? What do they, what is the emotional driver behind the thing that they want? Why do they want what they want? And only then can you really market and appeal to them and so forth. And then obviously, like, the more people you can empathize with or sell things to, usually like the more money you're going to make, which is obviously a very different ethos from this upper class professional snobbery, where the premium is not on empathizing with people from a different rank in society or whatever. It really comes from actually from almost like condemning them or looking down on them or elevating your own sense of superiority. So like I remember, and I'm not proud of this at all, but this is to illustrate the point in kind of a self-deprecating way. I remember when I was in the first week of college in freshman orientation, this is like that awkward period where, you know, everyone, like, you kind of meet people, but you don't really know them, and so you have to sort of mingle with them. And I remember I was in the dining hall, and I saw this guy who was a friend of one of my suite mate, or not my suite mates, one of the people in my dorm. And so, you know, I went over and I sat down and had lunch with him, and you know, we were asking about each other's backgrounds, and he told me that he grew up in Boston and his family owns a restaurant. And I remember, like, even before I thought about it, like, consciously or in a purposeful way, I remember that I was just, like, overcome with this real condescension, like this real judgment. And it was like this, I'd have to, like, really untangle it, but I think what was coming up was that I was thinking, oh, like, how lowbrow, like, how you know, like, how unrespectful to, like, be making your money off of, like, peddling kind of, like, cheap fast food or whatever to people, you know, which is, I thought was in contrast to like my parents and the people I grew up with, who were doctors and lawyers and whatever. Or, like, I remember another time this came up for me was oh, okay. Tell me if the noise is coming up again, and I'll try to change. I remember another time this came up was I was at a professional retreat, and this was like in 08, 09. So social media and Twitter were just sort of coming to the fore and becoming real tools of influence. And so they had this guy come. He was a young entrepreneur who had really seemingly mastered Twitter. And he was, like, you know, because I don't think he went to a top school. He wasn't all that lucid or whatever, but he was trying to explain, like, how to use Twitter and how to value it. And I remember I was just, like, reeking with contempt at this guy. Like he's trying to tell me that typing 40 characters on this idiotic social media platform is the way to affect political change. Forget it. And I was just so dismissive of it, and it took a long time to really come to terms with it. Now, okay, so there's this, if what I'm describing sociologically is correct, then I think that we're in for a period where we might very well see a new fault line emerging of conflict in our society between these upper class professionals and these business people. Because now that we have, you know, relatively deregulated markets, now that we have the internet, now that we have lower and lower transaction costs to really doing business and whatever, I think that this balance of power that's already been shifting is going to grow in spades, where now people who are entrepreneurs, who are businessmen, are just going to make more and more money. They're going to be more and more politically powerful, while at the same time, much of the premium that comes from being an upper class professional, whether it's a doctor, a lawyer, or whatever, so much of the authority, the credibility that they ultimately rely on to make money is just going to be disrupted by entrepreneurs and technology and whatever. Now, how will this play out? So like, there's a friend of mine in the Trump administration. I won't name him, but he's relatively senior, and you know, unlike a lot of these, like, rent-seeking technocrats in the Trump administration, I mean, this guy is actually a true believer. He's a genuine populist, and so when we talk about free trade and whatever, you know, sometimes, like, I'll say, you know, so what if there's disruption? We have to carry on nevertheless. And then he'll retort, you know, well, if it were the jobs of lawyers and engineers in Washington who were getting outsourced, maybe they'd have a different attitude about free trade. And you know, this is, I mean, it's true. Like, I suspect that if we do see, and I think we are going to see, lawyers and a lot of these bankers, financiers, whatever, I think that as we have more global competition, their jobs will be outsourced. They will be on the losing end. And so this is going to provoke a great deal of angst, very much like the sort that already has been happening at lower levels of society. Now, now the problem here is that even though I've been talking a little bit pejoratively about these upper class professionals, the truth of the matter is that they do have something real and serious to bring to the table, and that is that although I think I think that even though their snobbery and their negativity and their class judgment can have a very dark side to it, I also do think that it accounts for much of what's good in our society. So I think obviously having refined cultural taste, having a certain kind of work ethic, et cetera, I think are a big contributor to why many of the sort of ills that social conservatives decry, or many of the virtues that social conservatives praise, are actually very much alive in this upper class professional area, more so than they are among religious conservatives or whatever. And I think the other realm where this really shows up is in the realm of parenting. So, like one of the things that I've observed both anecdotally, but also whenever I've looked into different areas, like people who are Nobel Prize winners, or people whose children are disproportionately in gifted programs or whatever, they're obviously they tend to be very much overrepresented among this upper class professional class, and in particular, actually, I've noticed just anecdotally that many children who are very gifted or who really just end up doing well and succeeding tend to come from families where at least one of the parents are an academic, or have a higher degree. And again, I'm just speaking stereotypically and with anecdotes, but when you really see these children of successful families who really just become screw-ups and go downhill, usually they aren't necessarily coming from these upper class educated families. They're more coming from families that make a lot of their money in business, and especially when it happens in an overnight kind of way, where they have now all this money, but they don't have the temperament or the education or the general sophistication to be able to actually manage their money. That's where you get a lot of this stuff. Now, what's the way out? And I think that one of the reasons I'm optimistic that this tension can ultimately be resolved in a reasonably favorable way is because I think it's in the realm of online business, where you really have this area that takes and rewards the best of what both of these classes have to bring, the upper class professionals with the businessmen and entrepreneurs. Obviously, when you're trying to make money online and sell a good and service, it is a business, and you have to be entrepreneurial. You have to be willing to fail. You have to be empathetic. You have to have an abundance mentality and get out of this zero-sum thinking. But at the same time, this is an area where upper-class professionals really have an opportunity to display and show their talents. Where if you really look at the models that tend to work in online business, especially when you're trying to market to a niche, it doesn't come from the cheesy Hyundai ad on a billboard. It doesn't come from these obnoxious beer commercials on TV. What it really comes from is educational marketing, from really showing people, giving them a lot of free information, a lot of free value, building trust, showing that you have the expertise to be able to solve a problem. So a lot of the research skill, the analytics skill that in my view largely goes to waste in these academic programs and technical fields, now there's an opportunity online to channel these skills and attributes in ways that are not just going to some arbitrary hierarchy or ranking system, but is really being leveraged and channeled in order to be able to actually deliver real world goods and services. And if we create now using the dynamism and force of capitalism and free markets and competition to give these upper class professionals a way not only to show their expertise, but also now to generate the kind of wealth and freedom and influence that's necessary to be in power and exercise power effectively, then I think that that could be at least a check on these like uncouth businessmen, these lowbrow businessmen like Donald Trump and others coming to power only to find that they don't actually have the skill to govern effectively. Okay, that was a bit disjointed, but I think the point came across nevertheless. So let me know what you think. I'm curious what you think. I'm curious, actually, especially to hear people who grew up in upper class professional families trying to transition to entrepreneurship, and I'm curious generally if any of this rings true. So I'll let me know what you think, and I'll talk to you soon.